Welcome to episode 238 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent Judy Tyler, who served in the FBI for 31 years. Judy spent most of her career in the Philadelphia division working investigations targeting illegal drug gangs. In this episode, Judy Tyler reviews the long-term drug trafficking investigation under the federal drug Kingpin Statute of Maurice Phillips and his former girlfriend and business partner, Chanell Cunningham. Phillips was charged and convicted of drug trafficking, money laundering, and murder for hire for ordering and orchestrating the killing of Chinetta Glanville to stop her from testifying against him. Chinetta's godson, Dane King, an innocent bystander, was also shot and killed during the murder plot. Maurice Phillips narrowly escaped a death penalty conviction. Judy also explains the special procedures and phases of a death penalty trial. With her extensive experience in the investigation of violent drug trafficking organizations and advanced investigative techniques, post-retirement as a contract instructor, Judy continues to share her expertise training current FBI agents as part of a specialized in-service program. After our conversation, Judy let me know that the expert witness at trial calculated that at a minimum, Maurice Phillips' cocaine enterprise generated more than $30 million. Before we get to the interview, I want to welcome new listeners and invite you to join my reader team, where once a month I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. In my August email, I review the movie Corky Romano. Yes, I was able to find some teachable moments in the comedy. I also share some unbelievable news that I'll officially announce on the podcast next month. There's a link to join my reader team in your podcast app's description of this episode. Thank you for the support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Judy Tyler. Hi, Judy.
Hi, Jerry.
As of this recording, you have been a guest on FBI Retired Case File Review 4 times.
Well, thank you for having me on.
We're actually going to be talking about a case that we touched on during your very first time on the show, and that was episode 4, almost, 5.5 years ago, when I really didn't know what I was doing and how I was going to format the show. And so we kind of talked about your career, we talked about a couple of cases, and now I have focused the show on a case review, a deep dive into a particular case. And so we're going to revisit the Maurice Phillips case from the very beginning of the case to the very end. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. Well, I guess we should start off with 2 things. What squad were you on? What kind of work did you do? And we could just do that briefly, and we'll talk a lot more about that as we go through the case. And then the second thing is, who is Maurice Phillips?
I was on Squad 2, which investigated violent drug gangs in Philadelphia. And this case was indicted when I was assigned to it and ready for trial. So I was not the investigating agent. However, I was present for a couple of significant events. The case was started by the IRS and FBI jointly, Agent Frank Gormley with the IRS and Mike Parmigiani with the FBI. And they were looking at a particular fugitive in New Jersey. But you wanted to know who Maurice Phillips was? He's the head of the drug organization, kilograms of cocaine that were coming out of Mexico through Texas. He had his own tractor trailer trucks that would deliver them up on the East Coast and would return with the money back to Texas. So The cocaine came from Mexico to Texas, all the way up to the East Coast, up to New York, and make stops along the way. He was raised in middle class, had a college degree, and chose to become a drug pin. He didn't have to do that. He had a business background, and he applied it all to the illegal drug trade.
Almost kind of like a Stringer Bell type of character from The Wire.
Yes, but Maurice was pretty ruthless. And the reason this became a federal death penalty trial was because he hired a hitman to kill a witness against him.
Do you know how the case was predicated? How was the FBI introduced to Maurice Phillips?
Well, I know how Maurice Phillips came on the radar. It was a fugitive investigation of a drug fugitive living under an assumed name, Lamont Smith, over in Sicklerville, New Jersey. And when he was located, he had a house, a lot of assets in fictitious names. And Lamont Smith was arrested and began to cooperate at some point. And the money launderer who made the arrangements for all of the fictitious purchases and information, like the tax returns, the mortgage, the house, was Chinetta Glanville. She went by Chai as her nickname, CHI. I believe she was a college graduate and had a financial background. And she was a professional money launderer. She was in her mid-50s, I think. She had clients who were all drug dealers, and that's the service that she provided. She had a previous conviction for it and went back to it after her initial conviction. She created fictitious companies named Blue Diamond Capital Investment Group and things like that to purchase cars, houses, and obfuscate all of their investments, the drug money. And as I said, she had gotten caught doing this previously and pled guilty. That's my recollection, is that she pled guilty. On the 29th of May, 2002, our squad searched Chai's house and seized all of her records and her computer stuff. So that was the moment of truth for Maurice Phillips when he found out the FBI had seized all these records, because his were included among them. Lamont's wife, Fianna, went to Maurice Phillips and told him that the FBI had seized all of these records. And Maurice became quite concerned about her cooperating. Well, Chai did cooperate, and she reached out and was interviewed by Frank Gormley of the IRS under a proffer letter by the government, where she could tell us everything that she had done and not be prosecuted for anything that the government didn't already have. Frank spoke to her on the phone about it when she found out that Maurice knew. She had a conversation with Maurice and she said, "They've got everything. We're all going to go to jail." And at that point, she informed Frank Gormley that she told him that. And he said, I think you need to be careful. And she goes, "What's he going to do? Kill me?" Well, that's what ultimately happened. Maurice ended up hiring his nephew, Bryant Phillips, to come up from Tennessee and kill her. He made all of the arrangements. And I need to tell you a little bit about Bryant Phillips, who he is, and how that came to be, because it was many years later that we found out what had happened. Bryant Phillips was arrested in 2003 after he had killed Chai for statutory rape of a 15-year-old girl. And when the police arrested him, they found a gun at his house. He was already on probation or parole for a previous robbery. So he went back to jail, and Maurice paid his attorney's fees. He sent his girlfriend down to pay the attorney fees. And he asked him, "Can you give me some of your drug contacts that I could give up that'll help me get out of my case?" And Maurice said no, and he stopped sending him money. And at that point, Bryant ended up telling his attorney to call the U.S. attorney he needed to talk to them. He was given a proffer letter and he told the entire story of how he came to kill Chinetta Glanville. And that's how the crime was ultimately solved, because Maurice had specifically created an alibi that was verifiable of the time of the killing so that he could not be charged. The details of the murder were that Maurice had him come up from Tennessee, drive a car that could not be traced. So he used his girlfriend's car. He wired him the money under a false name from Baltimore through Western Union for the trip up. When he got up to New Jersey, where Maurice was living, Maurice took him on a dry run and showed him where the house was. The house was on 79 Louise Lane around Ardmore in Pennsylvania. 7900 Louise Lane, I think it is. Anyway, he gave Bryant a FedEx shirt, a FedEx box, and a gun, and told him to go over and do the murder at 10 a.m. specifically, because then he would have his alibi. His alibi was he was paying his taxes in the tax office, so he'd have a date-stamped record of where he was, and the tax office was near the police station, and a police lieutenant who knew him saw him and had a conversation with him at that exact time.
Wow.
So that was,
yeah, that's a pretty good alibi.
Yeah, it was airtight. Even though he was suspected right away, you knew he couldn't have done it, but we didn't know who had done it. Bryant said that he went over to a shopping center, went in and bought some gloves and sunglasses and a hat. Then he parked the car and went through the backyard, through some hedges, went to the front door. And when he knocked on the door, Dane King, who was fixing her computer, it was her godson, answered the door and said he would take the package. And he said, no, I have to give it to her. So he let him into the hall, and she had just come back from picking up breakfast for them. They had the receipts on the food. He said, I have something for you. He pulled out the gun, and she said, I don't have any money. He made her lay on the floor, and he put 2 bullets in her head. And at that point, Dane King came after him and kicked at him, yelling and screaming. And he emptied his gun and killed Dane and left 2 bodies in the house. I think he left through the open garage door. And he went back to his car. He stopped at a gas station and put all of the clothing he wore in the trash. And then he disassembled the gun and threw pieces of it away all along his trip back to Tennessee. He didn't go back to Maurice after he did it. Very little time elapsed from the murder when the cable guy arrived at their house for an appointment to fix their cable. And he discovered the bodies and called the police. And the police came right away. They notified the FBI because they were aware of the fact that we had searched the premises a couple of weeks earlier. And that is what put this case into the next level when you have that happen.
Now, there's a picture that you sent me of a house. Is that the house?
The house with the yellow tape is the Louise Lane one, and the open garage door.
Can we go back in time at the part of the case where Chai is killed? You said that it was several years later before anyone found out exactly what happened and who did it. But I take it that the FBI and IRS immediately thought that Maurice Phillips was involved.
Yes, and requested an interview. He was interviewed with his attorney, of course, denied everything and had an airtight alibi. You know, you can't have a better witness than a police lieutenant who had a conversation with you at the exact time in another state when that happened.
And so what happened to the case? With Chai dead and all of this evidence still sitting there that shows that she was laundering money for him and I take it other people, what happened to those cases?
So the cases were continued to be investigated. As I said, I was not the investigator during the case. The case went through several investigators. Kathy Downs took over for Mike Parmigiani. Ultimately, Frank Gormley retired and Scott McLeod came in for the IRS. So it reminds me of a relay race of the handing off. And I was the very last one for the trial. I learned as much about investigation in preparing for the trial and through the trial itself. We had a large number of people who ended up cooperating in the case. So you still have your drug case, even though you haven't proven the murder at this point.
Okay, so the investigation of Maurice Phillips for drug trafficking, that still continued.
Oh, yes. And there were many events. So I liken it to chapters in a book of all these significant events that happened after the murder. So I think the easiest way would be to start with talking about the relationship he had with Chanell Cunningham, who was a female drug dealer as big as any male drug dealer I ever investigated. And there were very few women of that level of drug dealing. She met Maurice Phillips in 1998 in New York at an all-star game and realized that he could supply her, and she had a whole network in Philadelphia that she could put together. So she had a real skill set. She used to do party planning and she was organized. She would get $1,000 for every single kilo that she moved. And ultimately, she became his mistress of 7 years. It was as much of a business relationship as it was of a romantic one. The two of them together were a phenomenal team, really. Chanell with her skill set and his. She was actually the one that had introduced Maurice to Lamont Smith, the fugitive that got arrested. And she also introduced him to Chai and many other suppliers. One of the suppliers was Mark Harris. He was the Baltimore connection, and he had a whole network in Baltimore. When he testified in court, it was an emotional moment where he asked the judge if he could say something to Maurice out of the sight of the jury before trial began. And the judge permitted it. And he looked at Maurice and he said, "I love you, man. And I'm sorry, but there's nothing I could do about this." Maurice and he had a very close relationship. He had been at his wedding in the Turks and Caicos. It was difficult emotionally to testify against him.
So why did he? What was he getting out of testifying against Maurice? Because it does sound like it was something he felt he had no choice but to do.
At the time he was arrested, he had gotten out of the drug trade and had gone legit, invested his drug money into a business. I think it was asphalt or something like that down in Maryland, had gotten married to a lovely woman, but she had no idea about his drug past. He said to me, "You don't know how hard it is to live with the knowledge that you could come and knock on the door one day and I'd be accountable for all of that." So it was a huge relief when it finally happened, because that cloud weighed heavily on him. So at the point that he was arrested, he was really out of the drug game and had turned his life around and didn't want to go back into it. So the emotional loyalty to Maurice at that point, I think, was waning, but he still had brotherly feelings for him. Mark managed a lot of the Maryland parts of the drug empire, I'd say, and they were getting $25,000 a kilo down there. One of his guys was Ron Copper, who agreed to get a CDL and learn how to drive a truck so he could transport the drugs and work a regular truck driver, but then intersperse the drug transports for him. And one of the other people he had in his network was a guy by the name of Pinder, who got caught driving through a radar stop. And it turned out to be a car chase with a canine officer on the scene. And the dog alerted on Pinder, who was sweating and agitated and angry. And when he walked back to the police officer's car, he took off and jumped back in his car, and they had a chase. He ran into a pedestrian walk and jumped into the Chop Tank River with the drugs in a backpack and was putting them underwater. A female police officer ran into the river, pulled her gun on him, and another guy came and got him, and they salvaged some of the drugs out of the river. That was one of the seizures. He was one of the witnesses that testified. at the trial about his seizure. And as I said, there were a number of seizures that related back to Maurice. Old people, grandpa, and people in their 80s to do the transporting because he thought that it would look less suspicious.
What a nice grandson.
Theophilus Orr got caught in the truck with $400,000 down south. And so that seizure took place.
And Theophilus was another relative of his?
Yes. One of the older men who had serious health problems. But he got caught in one of the big trucks with about $400,000. If you look at all the lives he touched of all these people and how bad things happened for all of them, it's just incredible. Theophilus didn't cooperate right away, but ultimately did and testified in our case. So he would drive 50 kilos at a time from Texas to New Jersey. And actually his seizure was $482,000 from a truck in Tennessee. So after that truck, they switched to some cars. They had some specific cars with hidden compartments and then used that for a while, but it couldn't handle the volume. So that's when he had other truck drivers come in. One of the guys at the border that got caught, they told him, you're going to transport marijuana because it's a cheaper price per pound. They filled it with coke. He gets caught at the border and he got a lot of time. Oh my God. He testified to what they did to him. One of the old men he used was a guy named Grandpop McQueen. He was transporting the drugs and they get paid X number of dollars per kilo. McQueen had a son, Roderick McQueen, who was really worried about his father. He knew ultimately he'd probably get caught. So he got a couple of guys together and wanted to scare him up, Maurice Phillips, into not doing business with his father, how he testified. So they went over to a house that Maurice Phillips was going to, Donia Stewart, a girlfriend who was storing money for him. This is another thing Maurice did a lot. He had other people hold massive amounts of money for him, people that he trusted implicitly. He had keys to the house. And at this point, these guys went into the house believing he was in there, but only Donia was there. They tied her up with, I guess, zip ties they had. Maurice ended up coming home while they were there, and they took off in a Range Rover. She, at one point, had called the police, were responding. They pulled into the driveway. Maurice jumps into her car, backs up and hits the police car and explains what's happened. So they go and ultimately arrest Roderick McQueen on foot that night. They recovered the Range Rover, which had several $100,000 in it, I think. So Roderick McQueen got arrested for that robbery. Initially, he stated on the stand that he just wanted to scare him up so that his father wouldn't continue doing the drug business with him.
But while he was there, he
they end up robbing him. But they didn't get away with anything because the police response was so immediate. And then Maurice hit the police car. So they recovered $160,000 in that seizure. I think it was in the Range Rover.
And now, of course, Maurice has to explain what he's doing with all of that money.
Right. And the Range Rover's not in his name either. So how do you claim a car that's not in your name? That's the problem with using Chinetta to do all this work now. And she's, of course, not around. This is a year after Chinetta was killed. So the police apprehended Roderick McQueen, and Donia Stewart identified him. They recovered a gun, a hanky, a baseball cap on the roof of a shed that he had gotten rid of when he was running on foot. They had a goalie mask and flex cuffs. So Roderick got arrested for that home invasion. That was on the 15th of July. Grandpa wanted Maurice to bail his son out. He thought he could convince Roderick to not testify against him if he would pay his bail. Maurice did pay his bail, got him out. And then 2 weeks later, on the 30th of July, Roderick was coming out of a Chinese restaurant when Maurice pulled up in a black car and fired 3 to 4 shots and shot him. Roderick ran and hid in a bush and called the police and was rescued and identified Maurice as his shooter.
Well, it sounds like he should have seen that coming. Maurice was not going to bail him out on the promise that he wouldn't testify. I mean, he has taken one of Maurice's girlfriends hostage. He's stolen his money. He's possibly going to testify against him.
And his father continued to pressure him and said, if you love me, you'll do this for me. You will not identify him.
Even after Maurice shot him?
Yes.
Wow.
So he did. He recanted his testimony. I mean, he would not testify against him. And Maurice continued to run his drug empire. And Grandpa continued to work.
That's unbelievable.
He said he knew his father would end up dead or in jail for delivering the square thing, is what he called the cocaine. And he just wanted his dad out of it. The next chapter happens in October of 2003 with Maurice's nephew, Bryant Phillips. Bryant was a postman and he liked to go to strip clubs. He met Michelle Ellis there. She was a stripper. She has 2 children. They strike up a relationship. They were together almost daily for a year. She lived in the projects and she was arrear of her rent of $1,300. So she wanted to move in with him. She didn't have a lot of money. She said, could you help pay my rent or let me move in with you? And he said, I can't. I'm storing money for my cousin. And he showed her 2 duffel bags that had $3 million in them and showed her where they were and that he couldn't have anyone else living with him. Well, what does she do but go to the nearest guy that she knows that does robberies and says, I know where we can get some money. So she set it up and planned to spend an evening with him. So with the hopes of having sex, he goes in and showers. She unlocks the door for the robbers and she said, I have a surprise for you. And he comes out with a towel around his waist. The robbers take him into the bedroom and she and the other robber take the duffel bags out to the car and they wait for the guy that was securing Duran in the bedroom to come out. They're waiting. Finally, he comes running out and said, I killed him. She said, that wasn't the plan. He said, I couldn't leave a witness. So they drove to an abandoned building where they counted out the money. It took over 8 hours. It was in small bills. They still didn't finish it, but they divided it 3 ways. They split up then, and she goes to her sister's. She gives her sister some money, and she calls a cab, and she asks the cab to take her to Florida. Cab company says, well, we don't do that. And after the 3rd call, a cabbie came out and said, look, I'll do it on my own for $3,000, but I can't do it with cab company car. So he drove her down to Daytona and Orlando, and she rented an apartment for 6 months, and she, quote, tricked it out. She wasn't there for very long before the police told her family they wanted to talk to her.
Didn't she have 2 kids?
Yes.
Where were they?
I think she left them with her family.
Okay.
She may have taken them to Florida. I'm not really sure, but ultimately the family had to be responsible for caring for her children. So she flew back to be interviewed by the police and made the decision to cooperate. And she identified Kendall and Larry as the 2 guys that she set up for the robbery. And she pled guilty and was sentenced to 18 years. We had to do a lot of trial prep for every witness in this case. And I'll never forget being in the federal prison, going over her testimony the day before she was going on the stand. And we said, well, where is all that money? She said, well, I left it in the attic in Florida. At that point, we stopped the trial and had the FBI go check with the current owner, who happened to be an attorney, to go search the attic for the missing money. Ultimately, they were able to look in the attic. There was no money. So where that money is, I don't know. There's either a happy handyman who cleaned the house after she abandoned it, or she left it with some trusted friend for when she got out. She was young. She knew she'd have life after 18 years.
Well, I was going to say I'm surprised that she came back to be interviewed because she knew that she was involved in this murder. But I guess she knew she had no choice really as a fugitive, the prospect of never being able to see her family or her children again.
Correct. So she did her time in state prison up in the middle of New Jersey. My first interview of her was at that prison. The next time was preparing her for trial at the prison in Philadelphia right before coming over to court the night before. It was quite a story. But here's another guy, a relative of Maurice, who's now dead because he was storing money for him. As you can see, the violence just accompanies all of this stuff.
Can we talk a little bit about where Maurice was living? Because it sounds like he's got all of this money coming in. He's got it dispersed, with different people and in different businesses. But what type of lifestyle was he living? Was he showing off that he was generating this type of income?
Yes. He had really nice houses, really nice cars. They had a car dealer down in Maryland. He drove a sports car like a Lexus. Chanell Cunningham was his wingman, essentially, in organizing a lot of this stuff. He always had good cars, and they were in fictitious names also. He bought houses for Chanell. In between all of this, he got married and had a wife who was a school teacher. He obviously didn't share with her all of that other business he was doing. And it came to light when Chanell was living with him, and he left the house one day. He had a house in Sicklerville, a really nice one, and left his phone behind. She testified about going in and with his password and finding all these calls to Angie. So she called her and she said, "Who is this?" She said, "Well, you called me. Who are you?" She said, "I'm Maurice Phillips' girlfriend." She goes, "Well, I'm his wife." And the two of them begin comparing notes.
Uh-oh.
Oh, yes. Of time away. I mean, so he was dividing his time between the two. She thought he was on business trips. She, of course, thought he was doing the drug business when he was home with his wife. And, he had some children there. After that discovery, Chanell confronts him when he comes home and sort of pulls back a little bit. He decides to put Chanell into a business in Atlanta, a high-end clothing business. He paid over $1 million from New York. It was called Apollo. I mean, really expensive clothing. So Chanell decided she was going to live in Atlanta and handle that business down there. She spent time getting all of that stuff set up after this discovery about him having a wife. But ultimately, they resumed their relationship, and he bought a house in Delaware. He had multiple residences. And so the FBI is tracking all of this stuff and starting to seize vehicles with asset forfeiture, houses, putting Liz pendants is a legal thing so that it can't be sold. And as the FBI investigation is continuing, the seizures start happening faster, and the pressure is really on before the indictment happens.
And Maurice knows this. He knows that there is an active investigation. He's aware of the seizures that are occurring, how they're tying up his real estate property. Does he continue dealing drugs?
Oh, absolutely. That's how he's making his living. There was actually a seizure in Baltimore from him personally, money, and I think it was $800,000. They didn't have the drugs. I remember the police officer said to him, "You're going to have to answer to somebody for this money." So trying to sort of scare Maurice, somebody's going to be after you because you owe all this money. And he laughed. "That's my money. This is just the cost of doing business to him." He just walks away from it. He doesn't try and seize the money back. He doesn't file for anything. So that's just a straight out seizure. And you can't charge him for having money just for having it. He can fight it and say how he earned it legitimately, but he didn't have any way to prove that at one point. He did set up buying a number of properties up around Newark that he rented out to try and show a legitimate source of income. There were several searches that took place of the house in Sicklerville that Chanell lived in. was one of them. And in that search, one of the things seized was a seal-a-meal plastic heat sealer. That was what they used to seal all the money for transport, because Maurice didn't want anyone putting their fingers in the money and taking any out. So Chanell would count it up, seal the money in with the seal-a-meal, and then write with a magic marker the total on the package itself. Those packages would be transported by the tractor trailers back down to Texas to pay for the drugs. DEA in Texas got a bead on his drug supplier down there and was doing trash pulls. They pulled out of Ray Alvear's trash these same exact packages with the denominations 40,000, 50,000 on them. And Chanell testified at trial, that's my handwriting. I wrote that up in Sicklerville as a total for drug payments. So it was really nice how the puzzle pieces all came together at trial. Ray Alvear, the supplier from down there, also testified how he got the drugs and then would turn it over to the drivers. It was funny because in the prison, all of the witnesses against Maurice were coming in. We had 150 witnesses in this trial over a 4-month period. And they coined Philadelphia as Teledelphia because everybody was testifying against him.
Wow.
I think the trial had 3 defendants that chose to go to trial. The rest of them all pled guilty and testified.
And how many total?
Defendants, I'd have to look it up. I think it's 7 or 9. The indictment is 150 pages.
Wow.
And it covers a huge expanse of time with all these different seizures. And one of the highlights of the trial, I'm going to say, is with Chanell deciding that she was going to move on from Maurice, but she was still with him. She was in the house that he bought for her. And that's the house you have the photo of with the broken window upstairs. Chanell decided to go on the Love Boat cruise with a different guy and her family. Maurice was tied up with business, but the guy she booked the cruise with got locked up before she could go. So she got Bunchy, another guy, to go on the cruise with her. She ultimately married him. So she goes on this Love Boat cruise, actually took her parents and her daughter. She had about a 12-year-old daughter at this time, but her parents, who helped her out with her drug organization by cashing checks and doing things like that for her, and had to testify at trial. So she goes on this cruise, and when she's coming back, Maurice says, "Hey, I'll pick you up at the airport." So she tells Bunchy, the guy she's with, "Yeah, you got to take off because Maurice is picking me up." So her parents take her daughter and she goes with Maurice back to that house. Well, that night, the door is left unlocked and 2 guys come in as Chanell is in the bathroom, not feeling well from the cruise. They go up to rob Maurice. He's naked in the bed and dove out that 2nd-story window and landed on the ground. They had a taser, and I think he broke his hip or something. He got hurt pretty bad. The guys take off. I think they were going to shoot him, but didn't expect him to dive out the window. She goes down and wraps a quilt around him, and he says, "What should I do?" He said, "Well, call the police." She hadn't called anybody.
It is really dangerous being a friend of Maurice Phillips.
Oh, absolutely. And so the police respond and they do a search of the house. And of course, they find more drug stuff. So Maurice is in the hospital and Chanell, ever the loving girlfriend, is by his side when he tells everybody else he's been in a car accident. Nobody knows what happened except Chanell and the robbers, who are unidentified, of course. He tells Chanell, "Listen, my wife is coming to visit, so you have to leave. And by the way, she's pregnant." So he tells Chanell, "Listen, I put $100,000 under some jewelry box or something. It's hidden in the house." He said, "Can you go see if the police got that?" So she goes to the house, finds the money, sticks it for herself, and then comes back and says, "Yeah, the police got it."
Good for her.
Yeah. Well, she's planning her old, this is it. I mean, she gets married to Bunchy very quickly. And then, the whole case all the arrests get made. And the trial began January 6th of 2010. I was scheduled to retire and did in July of 2010. So this was how I spent my last 6 months in the Bureau. And I want to talk a little bit about the trial that all of this evidence came in through, because it was not like any other trial I'd been through. The fact that it was a death penalty trial was different from the very beginning. The case was tried by Judge Curtis Joyner, and jury selection took 2 weeks. We went through 2 panels of 150 people each. They had all filled out about a 50-page questionnaire prior to becoming a potential juror. The voir dire practice is where both prosecution and defense select the jury through certain questions, and the judge can strike people for cause. And each side is allotted a certain number that you can get rid of to impanel your jury. We went through almost 300 jurors to get a panel with 6 alternates. But I want to talk about the voir dire practice itself, which stressed out all of these potential jurors. I realized how stressful it was when one of them broke out in hives. You could see the splotches creeping up her chest onto her face at the thought of having to make the call in a death penalty case. It was very emotional watching all these people be questioned by these attorneys. I took copious notes throughout the trial, and I just want to tell you some of the reasons people said they could not serve on this jury. And it was explained it was going to be a long trial. It ended up being 4 months. There were 2 phases, the trial itself, and then the death penalty phase is a separate trial that occurs after the evidentiary trial. One woman said that she couldn't render a verdict. God works through us. It's preordained. She's just a vessel and is reluctant to sit in judgment and believes the criminal justice system is not good. Another juror stated they believe life in prison is worse than death. One woman said, I had a divorce lawyer and they are smarmy, lying scumbags. So she got struck for cause. One said she couldn't give the death penalty to Maurice Phillips if the shooter didn't get it. One said he grew up in Antigua and observed executions by hanging and feels the death penalty is not properly applied. One would require a higher standard, not beyond all reasonable doubt, but beyond all doubt, and could not follow the court's instruction. So those were some of the people who really struggled with the question and could not answer that question. Can you follow the law and apply it because of their religious or personal beliefs? But witnessing the voir dire itself was different than any other case I'd ever had.
So that's interesting that it's the same jurors for the evidentiary trial and then for the death penalty. Once they're done, they're not done.
No. And I want to talk about that. At the defense table, we had 3 defendants. They each had a lawyer, so that's 6 people. And then the federal government pays to have any defendant facing the death penalty gets a specialized death penalty attorney who will handle the death penalty phase, and that's their specialty. They are there for the whole trial in preparation of the penalty phase. So the government's paying both sides of the process. So for the trial, the verdict had to be unanimous. Jurors were allowed to take notes, and they did. We had 11 women and 7 men with 6 alternates. I believe we may have lost 1 juror and had to put in an alternate for some reason.
While you're talking about that, Judy, could you take a few moments to talk about the role that the case agents play? Now, of course, in this particular situation, the case agents who had investigated the case are long gone. And so now you've got to absorb all of their work and all of their knowledge. What is your role in the trial? Everybody thinks about the attorneys and the prosecutors and what they're doing. What is it that the agents are doing? Because it really is a prosecutive team.
It is. And you'll see in the photograph the size of this team. We had 2 prosecutors, and we had investigative agents, we had paralegals who helped organize all the evidence, and we had IRS specialists that were there every day for part of it. So you had an entire team, and there's the photo of what it took for a trial of this size. My role as the case agent was to sit at the table with the prosecutors and making sure I get the evidence pulled for them to submit. And then I'm making sure that every time they offer a piece of evidence that they move it into evidence. I keep notes. I keep copious notes so that we can refer to them later if we have to for cross-examination or whatever. That way they don't have to call the court reporter and get the printout. And then I would also go and spend every night in prison interviewing the witnesses for the following day. Our trial week went from Monday through Thursday. Fridays we had off to prepare for the next week, but it was really Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. When you are in trial, your attention is completely absorbed by what is happening, motions that they file. It might be the witnesses. You have to coordinate with the prison to bring them over for a certain time to be available to testify. It's almost like being the orchestra director behind the scenes. And then I testify to move evidence into court. Deborah O'Donnell testified from the Cryptanalysis Racketeering Records Unit as an expert witness. She analyzed the drug records that had been seized in this case and was able to come to a conclusion of how many millions of dollars those records represented, which was by no means the total, but it was in the millions. And how she went about analyzing them was fascinating, I thought. So I don't know if you've had anybody talk about this in any of your episodes, but this unit at headquarters decrypts any kind of coded message. And she began her testimony by describing the difference between legitimate records and illegitimate records. Legitimate records usually have amounts with decimal points and dollars and cents. They have printed paperwork for the business name, billing records. They look different than drug records or gambling records. They do records for any kind of code. It might be drug trafficking, loan sharking, prostitution, gambling, sports, numbers, internet stuff, video. They have foreign language capabilities. And the way they analyze them is, are they legitimate or illegitimate records to begin with? And then they get rid of all duplicates. The benefit always goes to the writer. It's always to the defendant's benefit. If there's a duplicate, they cross one out and they don't count it. They have analyzed tons of records and they keep a database of the cost of all the drugs and the years. So if you're analyzing records from the 1980s, you can find out what the cost of cocaine was in Baltimore at that time. They have the historical records so that they know that those prices are in line with what the actual prices were being charged at that time. They confirm their analysis once a defendant has pled guilty and they've done the analysis on the records. They follow up with interviews and go over those records with them to make sure their conclusions were correct. Once they do their analysis, they get it reviewed by an independent reviewer to see if they come to the same conclusions. It will never go to court if they differ in their opinions. I thought it was pretty neat that they follow up and go and interview the defendants whose records they've analyzed to make sure that they were right, have some quality control on their expertise. She said that she has reviewed records and determined they were not illegal. They were Yahtzee scores, but she was able to figure out what game they went to.
That's pretty cool. You've provided a PDF of 3 such handwritten records. I take it this was, something that was obtained as evidence in the Maurice Phillips enterprise. Yes. Where did it come from? And do you recall how much money is represented on these chicken scratch calculations?
Well, some came from the house in Sicklerville that was searched. Some was from Maryland. I'd have to look at her testimony for the number of millions that the conclusion was reached. But she was an impressive witness. And I had never had one in a drug case before.
And I've never used anyone from that particular unit for one of my financial crime cases either.
Had I had this experience with her earlier in my career, I would have used her on a number of cases. The services that they have, I was blown away by her testimony when she explained it in great detail. They give you a very conservative estimate at the end, and then I forget how many millions it was based on the number of kilos. So most of those records you're looking at are kilograms of cocaine. You're not looking at the dollars. It's how many kilos are out and awaiting payment. And it does look like chicken scratch. But if he has legitimate records, they would look different than this kind of stuff. What was kind of neat was the seizure in Maryland that happened years or so before had, I think she found commonalities in the accounting, like the same people, same names or something. She was able to tie it all together and explain it in a cohesive manner, better than I can do right now.
What was the name of the unit again?
It's the Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit. They're based out of the laboratory down in Quantico. And their mission is to examine manually encrypted documents and records of illegal enterprises, as well as to provide expert testimony and other forensic assistance to further identify terrorism, foreign intelligence, criminal activities in support of federal, state, local, and international law enforcement investigations and prosecutions.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And if you could explain to everyone the reason why knowing or having an idea of the amount of money that has gone through this criminal enterprise, what that means when it comes to sentencing.
Well, I'll tell you what it meant in this particular case, because he had so much and he paid other people to do his bidding. There was even a statement made to a prisoner in prison by Maurice. Somebody said, well, I would bet $500,000. Maurice said, I'd wipe my ass with that. I'm worth millions out on the street still. So this is him in prison bragging about his ability to get things done through all the money he has stashed with relatives and people still out on the street. We tried to get as much as we could, but we're limited by the witnesses that we develop. So she was able to calculate, I guess, the quantities of drugs and then translate that to the amount of money that he had represented only in these few seizures of records. In my previous case that I discussed, the Maurice Lewis case, they kept their drug records, but the record keeper would rip each page off and destroy it. And we were able to look at the indented writing underneath to get a snapshot of 1 week's worth of records. So drug records are an important component to allow you for your asset forfeiture. Because if you look at all the seizures, 400,000, 800,000, that he walked away from time and time again throughout this case. He even used his wedding to money launder. People would give him checks for the wedding. He'd give the check back and say, write it for more, and I'm going to give you the cash back, so that he tried to show legitimate income as wedding gifts. We had witnesses testifying about that. And the IRS did a phenomenal job on all of the money part of it. They had it all laid out with charts and photocopies of the checks and everything.
You know, most of the time you think about a drug case, you're not even thinking about following the financial trail and, working with the IRS.
That's huge. We have accountants, and I always like to get an accountant assigned to my drug case because it's a parallel investigation. If you follow the money, it always takes you to the drugs. The two cases are side by side, merging together. Follow the money, you're going to find the source ultimately. So this trial ended with a guilty verdict. They were all found guilty. And on April 17th, the death penalty phase began. And that went till April 26th. And the jurors deliberated for 2 days. And I want to talk a little bit about that death penalty phase. It's totally different. So in the criminal trial, you have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to convict. In the death penalty phase, you have what are called aggravating factors and mitigating factors. The government puts forth the aggravating factors, the defense puts forth the mitigating factors. And then the jury has to decide by the preponderance of the evidence, that's 51% for or against each factor. The government's mitigating factors were that this was aggravated because he procured by payment the services to have him killed. There were other uncharged serious acts of violence that Maurice engaged in during this time period. There was an assault on one of his girlfriends, Deborah Grace. She filed a protection from abuse order. There was 2 other assaults that never went into court, but had criminal complaints. He had the contemporaneous conviction of killing Dane King, who was Chinetta's godson. He was maybe 20. Dane's mother attended this trial every day. She had cancer. She died after the conviction, but she never knew what the sentence was. This was heartbreaking because they testified at the impact of the death of their son, the father and mother of Dane King, who happened to be there. Collateral damage is the way Bryant Phillips saw that. One of the factors was he was the Kingpin statute, essentially. He was the CEO and CFO of this whole organization. And the victim impact and the obstruction of justice. There was witness intimidation. One of our witnesses was assaulted in the federal prison. And throughout the investigation, he tried to make sure people didn't testify against him. So future dangerousness was one of the aggravating factors because of that statement he made that he had the money out on the street still, even though he was in jail, that he could get things done. The defense put forward the mitigating factors. They said the relationship with his children has changed forever. Who will explain to them why he had to be eliminated from the human race? Humanity, intelligence. I ask you, please spare his life. This is not an excuse for his conduct or to justify or explain the mitigation. It's about making a unique choice. Is death the only answer? Future danger, she addressed. She said, if he's in prison, they can corral him and keep him from doing that. One of the things she did was bring in prison experts who show a training film of how they can control a prisoner who is non-compliant. It was a video of someone who refused to do what he was told and how they had to restrain him. So she showed that film to show them that you can control people in prison. She said that he had a loving, involved father. His friends and family will suffer guilt over the loss of him. I'm reading from some notes that I took during her presentation. Life has value was the theme. His wife was in the courtroom. She was crying. She was asking, she only needed 1 vote for life, for him to get life versus the death penalty. And after 2 days of deliberation, 1 juror held out. So Maurice got life. He got life in prison. And so that's what he's serving today. One of the hard things to swallow about this whole case was Bryant Phillips, the guy who pulled the trigger. He pled guilty and got 10 years because we couldn't use what he told us against him. We did not have the evidence.
This is the FedEx, the quote-unquote FedEx guy.
Yes. And so they say, well, if you're not going to make him pay, why should Maurice? It's hard, but we have to live with the rules that we have. Ultimately, it was an 11-1 split, and 1 juror held out.
And his life was
spared. And so he's been in prison. They asked to have him serve his sentence at the Supermax facility in Colorado, and I don't believe that was granted.
So do we know where he is?
I don't. I didn't try and find where he is now. It's been many years. Chanell Cunningham was sentenced to 12 years for her role. She was a drug kingpin in her own right, and she would have been facing a long term had she not cooperated. During the trial, Chanell testified to a pillow talk conversation she had with Maurice about the murder of Chai. She said, "Did you have anything to do with that?" He said, "I did it for you. I couldn't see us going to jail." Actually, during the murder, he sent her to Atlanta, made her take a flight. So she had an airtight alibi also. She was funny. I wanted to say one thing. When I went to the prison, or kind of a rural prison in South Jersey, to interview her prior to travel, she was talking about life in prison. And she was so creative. She missed being able to have a scrunchie to pull her hair back. So she chewed the rim of her socks off to have an elastic band and let her socks fall around her ankle. They were celebrating a birthday of another inmate. They saved all their potato chip bags for the silver lining, and they wove a little crown for her head and made a placemat for her to serve her food. She said she really missed dental floss. They don't give you dental floss in prison. And she said, "Is there any way you can bring me Q-tips the next time you come to interview me? I haven't been able to clean my ears." So I did that for her. And I had a little Ziploc bag and I watched her clean her ears. And she goes, "I could have made candles with this wax." But that's what you miss when you're not out living your life.
The little things that, we take for granted that she missed.
Yeah. She's out now. I would imagine her 12 years are up. And I remember her saying to me, "When I get out, I'm going into business for myself. I've already incorporated it. It's going to be called Tickle Me Pink. It's going to be a sex toy business." So I've never looked it up. I don't know if she's done that or not, but that was her dream.
All right. I got to look it up. Hold on for a minute.
I cracked me up. She said, "I'd like to have a boudoir that's all pink and real comfortable so you could come in and sit down and enjoy the shopping experience." But she had, I guess, bought the domain or something while she was in prison.
It looks like there's a band called Tickle Me Pink.
Oh, well, I just remember I thought that was funny that she was putting her business plan together.
Yeah, I'm looking it up and it doesn't look like that particular name was used, but who knows? She may have a business out there.
Yeah, I don't know when she got out, but 12 years, this trial was 2010. Of course, she got credit for time she had already been locked up. So I'm fairly certain she's out by now. But you get to know all of these witnesses by spending time in prison with them, chunks of time, and you come to appreciate their outlook on life.
So you mentioned the drug kingpin statute. Could you talk a little bit about that?
It is an enhancement for sentencing time because it shows that you are in control of a certain number of people, 3 or more, I think it is. I forget the exact number. It's a separate charge because it has a higher penalty. I believe there's a 10-year mandatory minimum if it's a continuing criminal enterprise and you are the kingpin of that. In this case, the death penalty thing overrode all of it. But the role you play in a drug organization does enhance your penalty exposure. It would be much higher if you had a leadership role and had people under you working for you.
Well, this was a fascinating case review. And as I mentioned before we started, we talked about this for just about 10 minutes during your very first time on FBI Retired Case File Review, episode 4. And I know one of the things that you talked about is how overwhelming it was for you to have to get your arms around this case, all of the historical information, and look at all of the 302s and the searches and the arrest in order to be able to assist the prosecutors in taking this to trial.
Yes, I had to travel to Texas. We had so many witnesses in Texas. I went with the prosecutors to San Antonio and Dallas. We had the witnesses come from all over Texas to meet at hotel conference rooms to go over their testimony. There were so many, it was easier for us to travel there than them to come to Philadelphia. I've never had a case of this magnitude that I didn't investigate myself, where you know the case intimately. And so I had to rely on Kathy Downs, took the baton from Mike Parmigiani and did the lion's share of this work. She had gone to Budapest. I had to communicate with her and Parmigiani when I couldn't find what I needed. I want to pay tribute to the entire trial team. We had Nancy Dick, Maureen Barden, Frank Gormley, L.C. Wright was the prosecutor, Scott McLeod, Judy Shepard, Cindy Fusco, and Bernadette Farnham, who each played critical roles putting together this case. And it was very rewarding at the end, just going through the entire experience. And I would dedicate this episode to Frank Gormley, who passed away a couple of years ago. He unfortunately had a heart attack and died on the golf course doing what he loved.
Good for Frank. Rest in peace. During your very first time on the show, and that was episode 4, we really went deep into your career before you joined the FBI and once you became an agent. I didn't ask you the standard question I use now. So if you could just give us a brief indication of when and why you joined the FBI.
I joined the FBI in December of 1979 because I had read an article in the paper of what women agents were doing, and I had a 5-year police background and thought I can do that, and went in and applied. I didn't truly have an appreciation for the scope of what the FBI did until after I got in the Bureau, though. It was a wonderful career. I thoroughly enjoy it. I'm still involved with the Bureau in training agents in some specialty areas. I would encourage anyone who might want to have a career in the FBI to definitely apply, especially women. We need more. It's still underrepresented.
I like to end each episode by giving my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
I'd like to say thank you, Jerry, for doing this service to the public.
And that's the end of the interview. At jerrywilliams.com, you'll find a photo of Judy Tyler. There are also photos of Maurice Phillips, Chanell Cunningham, Chinetta Glanville, Dane King, the houses involved in the 2 crime scenes, a cocaine seizure, and the prosecutive team. Plus lots of news articles and those chicken scratch drug distribution records analyzed by the expert witness. This episode is the 4th time that Judy was interviewed on FBI Retired Case File Review, and in this episode's show notes, there are links to my other conversations with Judy. I hope you enjoyed the episode and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. If they're not sure how to listen to a podcast, have them read the post on my website, How to Listen to a Podcast. And make sure you follow FBI Retired Case File Review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. I would also love it if you checked out the link for my books in your podcast app's description of this episode. My nonfiction books, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, which goes through 20 cliches and misconceptions about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. And then there's the companion book, FBI Word Search Puzzles, Fun for Armchair Detectives. My FBI Philadelphia Corruption Squad crime series features flawed female FBI agent Carrie Wheeler in Pay to Play and Greedy Givers. All of my books are available wherever books are sold as ebooks, print books, and audiobooks. If you've already picked up copies of my books, please consider leaving a review. Reviews help readers find good books. Thank you for listening to the very end, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.